Welcome to another edition of Signal Conversation. Today we're joined by Sucharit Kodali, VP at Forrester Research. She's an expert on all aspects retail and e-commerce. Her research covers e-commerce forecasting and trends, merchandising best practices, conversion optimization, and social computing in the retail world. She holds a BA in economics from Harvard, an MBA from Stanford, and she was one of our very first Signal speakers at the inaugural Signal conference 10 years ago in 2012. Join me in welcoming Sucharita to a Signal conversation. Good to see you, Sucharita.
Oh, thanks for having me, John.
So let's jump right into it. It has been a wild last, 12 to 14 months. And I want to ask you about the pandemic. It has clearly changed consumer behavior. What are a few things that you see that might be interesting in that changed consumer behavior, particularly as it relates to large businesses like P&G?
Well, definitely the biggest change, of course, has been the growth in e-commerce and the number of consumers that are purchasing grocery products and consumable goods online. So that was definitely a huge change, because then there are implications for companies like P&G as to what channels of distribution make the most sense in that e-commerce landscape. Is it DTC? Is it your wholesale.com partners? Or is it marketplaces like an Amazon or an Instacart? So those are big questions about where do you distribute inventory. The other big change that I think in many ways indirectly impacted consumers, but directly impacts P&G is in the supply chain disruptions that happened in the last year. And I think that what really came from that was this sense of, historically, companies have always been, about really being kind of as efficient as possible and as low cost as possible. But that comes at the expense of nimbleness. And, when ships get trapped in the Suez Canal, or, kind of factories have to close because, workers are infected with the virus, that means that you need plan B. And a lot of companies didn't have plan B. And that's something that I think companies need to think about in the future, is how much slack do you build into the system, and how much do you end up investing in order to protect yourself against shocks like that?
You've tracked the impact of this pandemic on retail with a series of monthly posts, on sort of a heat map. I'm curious, how is it? How's the recovery looking? Is it kind of a linear recovery? Is it lumpy? What have you learned?
Well, in the US, it's been a fairly V-shaped recovery. And one myth that I think is often overlooked is that retail spending in 2020 was actually at its highest ever. And P&G saw that in its numbers, because it's heavily dependent on the essential retailers that did have banner years. So with respect to a recovery, they never had a decline. So I think that that's an important piece to keep in mind. Now, will the struggling sectors, will they recover? How is their recovery coming along? Substantially better than it was at this time last year. We are confident that those sectors that were most adversely affected, like the apparel sector and the restaurant sector, by the end of 2021, they should be mostly recovered. And we look to markets like China, which are further along. They were earlier in their cycle. They were faster to recover. And that absolutely, suggests that a lot of the traffic will resume, a lot of the old behaviors will resume. The single biggest factors really correlated with any kind of lumpiness is going to be whether or not a region goes into lockdown, and we've had more of that in Europe. So I think that's a region where they've really struggled with their retail recovery. In the United States, we at least have the Southeast, which has acted as if there was no pandemic at all.
Right. Now, earlier you mentioned direct to consumer DTC, and how companies have had to really rethink their relationship to that. channel, that's always been a place of some caution. Companies don't want to upset their really important partners at the retail level. But at the same time, they're watching smaller, nimbler competitors just start to eat their lunch and take over their brand space in direct to consumer. Do you think that that shifting balance is going to be permanently changed because of the pandemic? Do you think larger companies are going to commit more to DTC?
I think so. And there are a number of reasons. I mean, there's been tension for decades between merchants and brands. I mean, the private label conversations, I mean, these have been issues that are not new. And if anything, I think that what the pandemic, what e-commerce has exposed, what the ability to connect to shoppers directly has exposed is almost the ability for brands to turn the table and to own their customers and to have a direct connection to them. I think that some of the biggest myths that the industry has perpetuated is that people don't want to go to multiple stores to complete an online transaction. People go to multiple stores to complete all their grocery transactions. The easiest thing you can do is go to another website. So I think that there's a little bit of that myth that will be overcome in the next decade. There are some myths around profitability that I think will also be overcome, because I think that a lot of brands just either haven't had the right people or the right benchmarks or the right partners to get them to a superior direct to consumer presence. But I have confidence that's changing. We're seeing a lot of that, and we're seeing some strong DTC talent emerge.
Right. One of the things that, strikes me as maybe in the, room for improvement category is how to manage a brand in a world that's so fractured, where there's, a DTC world. You may have a lot of knowledge about your consumer, but how do you build a brand in that space as opposed to, what is a time worn, well understood, retail and wholesale approach? Do you have any advice for building brands in the world of digital and DTC?
That is a great question, John, and that is not easy. There are no shortcuts to building a brand, and that's why when you see digitally native brands launching in physical stores or digitally native brands opening their own stores, that is a testament to how hard it is to build a brand. But that is also exactly the reason why big brands that are already household names have a competitive advantage in the online DTC world, is that everybody already knows who you are. Your customer acquisition costs should theoretically be lower. The biggest challenge, I think, for brands is to re-educate customers about their URLs and to re-educate them that if you actually go to our URL, there's going to be useful content there for you. Because for 20 years, they had these websites where there was not content that made anybody's time worthwhile. So hopefully that will be the switch, and that will be the opportunity. I mean, brands don't even often have their own URLs on their packaging, or if it is, it's in like tiny little font on the back. I mean, this was like the year 1999 equivalent, where traditional retailers like wouldn't even put their URLs anywhere publicized on their own properties, like on their shopping bags or on their doors or in their stores. And if you don't tell people that you're open for business, how's anyone going to know?
How do you navigate the world of the platform? The platforms seem to have all the data. They understand how to merchandise, down to the individual. Are they the new gatekeepers here, or as you just suggested, do you think it's possible to both work with them and build your own, owned and operated, branded experience independent of them that might be more profitable?
Yeah, I think that definitely the latter. I mean, if we haven't learned anything in the last decade, it is to be wary of the platforms because they've got agendas and objectives that may not be aligned with yours. So I think it's incredibly important for every brand, every merchant to have its own relationships. We also into an era where there may be some pretty substantial regulation of all of these businesses in the coming decades. So to kind of hitch your future to kind of these businesses that may just be fundamentally changed, I think is a big question. There's also, I would argue, big questions around how much value are they actually providing because we did a study after the Facebook boycotts this past summer, where a bunch of brands, like 1,000 brands, decided, to boycott Facebook after the George Floyd riots. And what we learned was looking at all of the public companies that reported their sales figures, and there were quite a few that were, where the data was publicly available. Not a single one saw any negative impact from pulling its Facebook ads. So that begs the question, what are the brands delivering? What are the brands getting from the platforms altogether? And I think that's a question that everybody really, really needs to look hard at answering.
What changes or trends are you seeing that might not be, understood or might be overlooked in the marketplace?
Um, I think that one thing that is often, it's been oft repeated by brands over the last several years, is that we don't care where the sale is made. We just want the sale. And I think
Hmm.
that brands are realizing is that, wait, hang on, actually sales on our website are more valuable. We get more data and often we get higher margin too. So I think that what we may see in the next decade is a shift there, that kind of, that it's not it doesn't make sense to just say that you're completely brand agnostic. And maybe there could be challenges or limits to what your owned properties are able to deliver. And maybe there are partnership opportunities too, where there are preferred partners that can be your fulfillment partners, or companies where you're able to, while you capture the data and the part of the transaction you want, the heavy lifting on the fulfillment side can happen with other partners. And I think that that's the kind of creativity that we'll likely need. I mean, I've been watching e-commerce for, like you, for decades now, and it takes that long for change to happen. And I expect that we're still going to be having this conversation at Signal 2030. But hopefully, some of the CPGs will be further along, and the story will be a little bit more evolved than it is right now in 2021.
Well, sage advice. Sucharita Kodali, thank you so much for joining us for this Signal conversation. And I'm sure when there is a Signal 2030, we will be looking forward to welcoming you there. So again, thanks very much for your time.
Thanks, John. Thanks for having me.